Have you ever been on vacation or at the big game with your trusty digital camera on your side, only to get home and realize that a handful of your photos were blurry or out of focus? Inside the camera, its computer makes decisions on what it feels is a properly exposed photograph. The problem is sometimes the computer chooses the wrong settings and your photos come out blurry or out of focus. There are three main elements that make up the properly exposed photograph, and understanding these elements will help your pictures turn out better. Often referred to as the photography's exposure triangle, the three elements are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. According to Brian Peterson, author of Understanding Exposure, aperture is the hole located inside the camera lens. An aperture value refers to the hole and how much light is able to pass through the lens. Typical aperture values are called f-stops, commonly go 1.8, 2.8, 4.0, 8.0, 11, 16, and 22. The lower the aperture value, the lower the number, the more amount of light that is able to pass through the camera's lens and expose to the sensor. Shooting wide open creates a thin depth of field, which allows your immediate subject to be in focus while the background to be a nicely blurred effect. Now the problem with shooting at too low of aperture sometimes is if you focus in on your subject's eye, and if any reason you shift, their eye is not going to be in focus. Some part of their face will be blurry because the depth of field is so thin. You have to make sure that you don't move when you're shooting wide open. Stopping down is basically when you go from a wide open to a smaller hole in the lens. And usually what that does is it gives you a background and a picture that's totally in focus. So aperture is the first element in photography's exposure triangle. According to Scott Kelby, author of Digital Photography Handbook, shutter speed is the amount of time that the camera sensor is exposed to the available light. Shutter speed values are listed in fractions of a second. Examples of these values are 1/15th of a second, 1/30th of a second, 1/60th of a second, 1/25th of a second, and so on. The faster the shutter speed, the more ability you have to freeze your subject. So if you're doing sports, you'd want to use a really high shutter speed. Slower shutter speeds can cause the effect of movement. Basically, the shutter is held open longer, causing a blur of your subject. But at the same time, that's what usually the most problems are with your photography. Your shutter speed is too slow, which causes pictures to be a little bit out of focus and a little bit blurry. For a visual example, because I know this is a little hard to grasp, this here is a picture of a window with two shutters. Now if you could imagine, just picture inside of there a guy wearing sunglasses or something of that nature. The actual size of the window, that's going to be basically the aperture. The larger the window, the more light that's able to get into the room. The shutters, actually open and closing, would be the actual shutter speed. How fast these things can open can determine how much light can get in. So moving on to the final element of the photographer's exposure triangle is ISO. And basically what that is the camera sensor's sensibility to light, or sensitivity to light. And those values are usually expressed as ISO 100, 200, 400, and so on. The lower the value, the less sensitive to light. The higher the value, the more sensitive it is to light. Using too high of an ISO value can result in digital noise or a grainy look to your photos. On most digital cameras, the ISO is able to be adjusted, while aperture and shutter speed are more restricted to like your high-end point-and-shoot cameras or your digital SLR cameras. Now, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO are the three elements that make up photography's exposure triangle. Now, back to this. To show an example of ISO, if you picture the man here with dark sunglasses, that would be equal to like an ISO 100. Now, if he had just regular clear glasses on, that would be of a higher ISO, allowing him to take in more light from the window on how they're related. So understanding these concepts will help you and be able to troubleshoot all your mediocre and blurry photos and can give you insight on how to capture the perfect feature. Using a camera with the auto mode, the camera will typically decide what it thinks is proper exposure. For example, let's say if it chooses an aperture of 4.0, a shutter speed of 1/15 of a second, and ISO 400, with that photo with the small shutter speed, you'll likely result with a blurry photo. Now what you can do is, the triangle is when you move one item up, you can adjust the other one. So if you go from an ISO 400 to 1600, you're able to move your shutter speed up to 1/60 of a second, which is usually sufficient for getting a proper clear photo. So basically that is an explanation of the photography exposure triangle and how it can help with your photos.